I sat beside Francis for a few minutes after he had died, holding his hand. He had a peaceful expression on his face. And then I looked through his pockets until I found the keys. I got up, left the bedroom, went downstairs. The stereo was still playing. I unlocked the front door, opened it, and stepped outside. I didn't have a flashlight. The only illumination came from the star and the moonlit sky above and the porch light over the front door. I walked away from his house, stumbling down the driveway in the dark to the road. I looked back at the house where I had been held captive, seeing it for the first time from outside. Even in the dim moonlight, I could see it was in a state of disrepair. The paint was peeling, and the grass of the front lawn was heavily overgrown. All the windows were dark because they had been boarded shut from the inside. It looked like a house that had been abandoned for years. The kind of house that all the neighborhood kids probably thought was haunted. And in a way, it had been. Haunted by the vengeful ghost of a murderous, misogynistic psychopath and his tortured, mentally unbalanced brother. I turned and looked down the road. Francis Voigt's house appeared to be at the end of a dead-end street in a residential neighborhood. It was further away from the other houses by quite a distance, as if it had been shunned. I began to stagger down the road in the direction of his closest neighbors. I was shivering. It was a chilly February night, and my prom dress was torn to shreds. I had almost reached the next house when I saw something up ahead. Approaching headlights. A vehicle. I heard the sound of its engine getting closer. I lurched down the road like a zombie towards it. It got closer. I stepped into its path, not waving my arms or shouting, just walking, not thinking that in the dark the driver might not see me until it was too late and hit me. I was numb, vacant, in shock. The vehicle screeched to a stop bare inches in front of me. It was some kind of utility maintenance truck. The driver flung open his door and stepped out, looking at me in wide-eyed shock at my appearance. A beaten, bloody woman in torn clothing standing in the middle of a deserted street at night. "Are you all right?" he exclaimed in a shaken voice. "Help me," I croaked, and then I passed out. I woke up hours later the next morning in what I instantly realized was a bed in a hospital room. Bright sunlight was beaming in through the windows. My head ached, and my face hurt. I couldn't get my right eye to open. It felt swollen shut. I gingerly touched my right cheek, where Ted had struck me with a pistol, and felt a bandage. "Oh, thank God!" a familiar voice cried out in relief to my left. "She's awake!" I turned and saw two faces that filled my heart with joy. My sister Rebecca and my son Anthony, sitting in chairs beside me. Both of their faces were etched with lines of worry, their eyes heavy with exhaustion and stress. Rebecca's usually perfectly groomed hair was disheveled. They must have driven all night from Mississippi to be here with me in Louisville. "What did he do? What happened?" my sister asked me anxiously. "What did he do to you?" I opened my mouth, trying to find my voice, trying to speak. But the presence of the two people I loved most in my life left me so overwhelmed that all I could do was burst into tears, weeping hysterically. Rebecca and Tony followed suit, and for a while, all the three of us could do was cry. When we had ourselves more or less under control, Rebecca again asked me what had happened. I gave them my ordeal in broad strokes. An insane, delusional fan of my old television show had abducted me from my house and kept me prisoner in his in order to reenact his favorite episodes with me. I didn't feel up to giving them a more in-depth rundown of the psychosis of my captor and his dual personalities, his obsession with me, or what exactly he had tried to do to me. Tony explained that when he had come home from school the day I was taken, he had known something was wrong right away just by the fact that my car was still in the driveway and my purse and phone were in the living room, but I was nowhere to be found. When he had gone upstairs and seen my bedroom door had been busted in, he had called the police immediately. The police had come and done a search of my house. In the laundry room, they found my dog, Russ, dead. The police had come and done a search of my house. In the laundry room, they had found my dog, Russ, dead, with his neck broken. I guess I wasn't too surprised to hear that my dog was dead. I had already half suspected that was the case by this point. The police department had searched my house thoroughly, but had found no clues to the identity of my kidnapper. No fingerprints, hairs, etc. They found the roses and the messages he left for me in the bathroom. Happy Valentine's Day, Emily. And after Anthony had explained to them my past as an actress in the show Till Death Do Us Part, they had concluded with a fair amount of certainty that I had become the victim of an obsessed fan. The doctor came into my room around this time, looking pleased to see I was awake and lucid. He explained to me that apart from my cheekbone, which had been fractured, all my other injuries were fairly minor scrapes and bruises. They had found no evidence that I had been sexually assaulted while I had been unconscious the first time, after Francis had taken me from my home. After the doctor left, a couple uniformed police officers came in to see me and asked me some questions. I explained to them what had happened, gave them the identity of the man who had abducted me, and told them he was dead in his house, in a bedroom upstairs. A different doctor, a woman, came to visit me a few hours later. She explained to me that they would probably keep me at the hospital for about a week to monitor me for further physical injuries or psychological trauma I might have suffered. Not long after, Rebecca and Tony left. By then it was late afternoon and they wanted to get back to the motel they were staying at before rush hour traffic got too bad. Rebecca gave my hand a reassuring squeeze and they promised they'd both be back tomorrow. I had trouble falling asleep that night and lay awake for a long time until a nurse administered a sedative. True to their word, Rebecca and Anthony came back the next day, although they had to find their way through a throng of reporters clustered into the hospital corridor, assailing them with questions, trying unsuccessfully to cram into my doorway to get a peek at me. By then, the news of my story had broken. It actually made pretty big national news for a little while. Retired TV actress kidnapped by deranged fan. And I was, ironically, finally the celebrity I had tried so hard to become as a younger woman. Although, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, by then the COVID-19 outbreak was spreading rapidly and I was soon overshadowed. My former co-stars from Till Death Do Us Part, Miranda O'Donnell, Trey Cullen, and Spencer Newton, all paid me a surprise visit to see how I was doing. It was a pretty enjoyable reunion, and probably the only real bright spot in that whole ordeal. We caught up on each other's lives. Trey had struggled with alcohol addiction, but was now clean. Miranda's husband had died of a stroke the previous fall, and Spencer was married with his first child on the way. We talked about old times, joking about our time on the show. I was also visited by both Neil Goodman and Kyle Wheeler, who had played, respectively, Chad Richardson and the real Eddie Caldwell on the show, which made me feel weirdly disoriented and a little disturbed. And finally, and probably the funniest thing to happen, I was visited by a producer from the Lifetime Network, attracted by the publicity I had garnered, who wanted to make a TV movie based on my whole ordeal, with me portraying myself, if you can believe it. I seriously debated it for a few seconds, but then turned him down politely, even though I probably really could have used the money to help cover my hospital bill. It seemed like it would have been a pretty tasteless thing to agree to. I didn't want to exploit either my own traumatic experiences or Francis's tragic life story. On the third day I woke up in the hospital. On the third day after I woke up in the hospital, I was visited by a grim-faced detective of the Louisville Police Department named Carter. He was an older man, probably mid-60s and not far off from retirement. He explained to me that he'd been one of the detectives who had investigated the series of murders committed by Francis's brother, Ted, back in the mid to late 90s. Detective Carter and his partner had actually interviewed Francis after his brother was arrested. He told me that police investigating the Voight house had made a pretty disturbing discovery. Over a dozen driver's licenses of young women who had disappeared over the past 12 years. They had been found in Ted Voight's old room in a desk drawer. Cadaver dogs had already located at least 6 graves in the backyard. Police believe that Francis had probably picked up the girls hitchhiking, subdued them, and then driven them back to his house. I felt like I was going to vomit. Detective Carter went on to explain that after Ted had been convicted, Francis had been placed with a foster family in Middletown. He had only lived there for about 6 months before he snapped and murdered his foster parents, beating them to death with a baseball bat in their sleep. Police had discovered evidence of child neglect as well as both physical and sexual abuse in the house. After that, Francis had been placed in the Central State Hospital, a psychiatric facility where he had remained for the next 6 years. I remembered what he had told me. That night we had danced together in his living room. My foster family, they weren't nice to me either. I kind of went crazy when I was 13. They had to put me in a psychiatric hospital. The man he had murdered in front of me while under the influence of Ted had been the psychiatrist he had been seeing regularly ever since being released 15 years ago. At some point, Francis had stopped taking the antipsychotics his psychiatrist had prescribed, claiming they caused him headaches. Detective Carter told me that the police had interviewed Francis's coworkers at the mall. He hadn't had any real friends and had been something of a loner who kept to himself. However, they had noticed that lately he had seemed to be uncharacteristically upbeat and cheerful, like a man who had gotten some extremely good news. Later that same day, 2 more detectives from the county where I lived in Mississippi came, having made the 5-hour drive to Louisville to see me. I told them everything that had happened. They had been in contact with the Louisville police and had a pretty good idea of everything. Francis had apparently located me using a private investigator he hired. He had taken 2 weeks off from his work at the start of the month and had driven down to Mississippi, staying in a motel off the interstate. He had paid cash and signed the register, Eddie Caldwell. Police believed he might have been stalking me for a week or better before he made his move, following me and spying on me from afar undetected. He had watched my house and seen me coming and going, getting my daily routine down. He would have known what time I left for work. He also would have known that I tended to park my car in the driveway instead of using the garage. On the morning of February 14th, after I had left the house, he had broken in, forcing open a basement window and squeezing through it. My dog Russ had tried to defend the house, and apparently Ted had taken over. After Russ was out of the way, Francis and Ted had opened my garage from the inside and stashed his car in it. They knew this because they had found the tire tracks in the grime on the garage floor that matched the pattern of his, and then closed the garage door so I wouldn't notice it when I got home. And also so he could stow my unconscious body in the trunk without being observed. And that's pretty much it. I attended his funeral, you know. My sister and my son thought I was crazy for wanting to do so, but I feel weirdly obligated to. In spite of everything he had put me through, I empathized with him. I still do. That lonely, hurt, orphaned boy who had escaped from one monster only to find himself in the clutches of 2 more. That wounded, frightened little boy whose original tormentor he hadn't been able to escape, even in death. That boy whose only solace had been in the fictional world of a TV show and his dream of being with the girl he idolized. I was the only one who attended the service, apart from the priest who presided over it. He said a brief prayer for Francis and then approached me, having recognized me from TV. He explained that he had known Francis's family when he had been a child, before his parents had died. He said they seemed like a perfectly ordinary, happy family, and Francis seemed like a sweet, sensitive boy, although his older brother Ted had always seemed angry and grudging. After the priest left, I stood in front of the open grave looking at his casket for some time. I looked at the family monument above it, reading their names. I was surprised to see that his brother Ted was there with his parents. Francis himself must have paid to have him buried in the family plot after his execution. Joseph Donald Voigt, September 7th, 1946 to April 10th, 1993. Harriet McGill Voigt, May 23rd, 1947 to April 10th, 1993. Theodore William Voigt, March 17th, 1975 to July 29th, 2007. And in the bottom right corner, the newest inscription. Francis Avery Voigt, June 24th, 1986 to February 15th, 2020. Standing there at the grave, inexplicably for no reason at all, I suddenly remembered that final song that had been playing from the stereo on Francis's prom mix that night, as I fled from his house for the final time after he stabbed himself to death, finally standing up to confront his personal demon and sacrificing his own life to save the only woman he ever loved. Fade Into You by Mazzy Star. You live your life, you go in the shadows, you'll come apart, and you'll go black. Some kind of night into your darkness. I turned and left the cemetery. I went back home with Rebecca and Tony and tried to recover and put it all behind me. I see a therapist to help me cope with the mental scarring it all caused, and I still occasionally suffer from anxiety attacks and bad dreams, but besides that, I'm pretty much back to normal. There's just one last thing. Something happened last week. Something I cannot explain. It was my 46th birthday, and I had just gotten out of the shower. I was getting ready to go out for dinner with Rebecca, and I stepped into my room and stopped dead. Lying on my bed, on my pillow, was a single, fresh-cut red rose. I grabbed my gun from the nightstand drawer where I always keep it now for fast access and quickly did a check around my house. There was no one there. The doors were all locked. I always make sure to keep them locked when I'm home alone. And after what happened in February, I also invested some money in a good home security system. Tony was at school. I was alone in the house. I went back into my room and stared at the rose on my pillow. After a while, I sat down and picked it up, turning it over in my hands, lost in thought. I thought about Ted's last terrified words. I don't want to go back there. I don't want to burn again. Had it really all been in Francis's mind? I wondered. Had he really suffered from dissociative identity disorder and Ted had just been a projection of his subconscious brought on the trauma he had endured as a child? Or had something else been going on entirely? Something that perhaps went beyond the grasp of human understanding. I think about Francis's last words to me. I love you. I always have. And I always will. Till death do us part. Was even that true? Till death do us part.